So typically when people write books like this is because they see a need in the marketplace. They see a need in their community or otherwise. They see a need somewhere. So let's start with compensation. How bad are we at negotiating compensation?
When it comes to compensation, I see a lot of recurring issues, right? One, people are really afraid of hearing no. And sometimes it's that fear of getting that no. And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it confrontation, you can call it rejection, whatever the case may be. But it's that fear of hearing the no that, in the first place, may even prevent the person from mustering up the courage to ask, right? And then two, once you get that actual no, that might stall the conversation and prevent you from advancing your needs. And so I don't know if it's that. And then the third thing that I see too is that people feel as though, how do you assess your value? Right? How do you, when you're talking about comp, especially if you're in an industry that's not transparent in terms of what people with your education experience, marketability, your specific set of skills, right, are earning? How do you know how to align your value with your ask? And especially if there's a set amount. So when I think about comp, I think about pre-comp. So before you get that job, right? Before you're responding to an ad or what have you, and you currently do not work there. And so you're like, okay, maybe there's a salary range and you're trying to figure out where you put yourself in that range. And so that's hard to say. One thing that people use, of course, is what they're currently earning if they're already in the field. So that's kind of a marker. In many jurisdictions, however, it is not permissible legally. A recruiter can't ask, and the company can't ask what you're currently making. For example, in New York, recruiters can't ask you and companies can't ask you what your current salary is. And that's because historically, many people of color, many people who check different boxes, were not compensated fairly. And they couldn't kind of move out of that bracket to the next bracket because they would have to say what they were being paid. So if you were already being underpaid, and then you have to then tell that to the next person, why will they be incentivized to pay you what you're worth or your value or even what the market could bear? If you're making, $5,000 and you could be making $100,000. And so when it comes to comp, if it's pre, meaning you haven't started there, I really like to encourage people to ask for what you want and ask for what you need, right? And think about why you're asking for what you want. Is it pegged to what you believe your value is? Is it what you know the market will bear? What information do you have? Because information is power. So what information do you have that you can use in that conversation? The other part of it, Will, is if you already work somewhere, right? So you already work there, and now you're like ready to seek a pay increase, or are you trying to have a pay something where you are already there, but you're doing more work? Maybe they gave you more responsibilities because someone left, or they restructured the organization and now more is falling on your shoulders, but they haven't sort of trued up, if you will, for how much they should be paying you. So there are different reasons someone could want a salary increase when they're already employed somewhere. That is sometimes more difficult to do too, right? Because maybe you don't want to ruffle any feathers, or you don't want to come across the wrong way. Maybe the market in general is bad. And so there are all these things that people sort of tell themselves as to why they shouldn't ask for more, tell themselves as to, okay, if they say no, I'm just going to stop. No. So when it comes to compensation, I don't think we're bad at it. I just think that there are many reasons, both like systemically and also economically, like just thinking about general economics. And of course, just like the emotional roller coaster that you may have internally when you're trying to muster up the courage to even make the request. And then what happens if they say no? I have people ask me this all the time. What if they say no, Will? Like, what if you ask for something and they tell you no? Does the conversation end there?
Do you have to be willing to walk away? In your opinion?
Yeah, well, what did you say?
Do you have to be willing to walk away?
I think you have to you have to be aware of what your options are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to understand where you are in your timeline. So for example, if you just signed a deal or contract or you just begin working, because in some jurisdictions there isn't an employment contract, right? It may just be an offer and acceptance, and then you start working and you're an at-will employee. That's my lawyer hat coming on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But what if you just sign and you just agreed to salary, and then you get there and you're like, oh man, this is way more than they told me I was going to have to do. And that's happened to all of us, right?
yeah,
Where the
yeah,
responsibilities didn't really fit the job description. What do you do? Do you walk away? That is an option that you have. Do you sit it out for a bit and say, okay, let me see how this works. I'm new here. Or do you start looking for, do you start saying, okay, I'm going to ask for an increase, right? The timing of that, right, may be an issue, for a variety of reasons. As a person who has started two companies, you budget, right? You think
yeah.
about what you're willing to spend and what you're going to do, how much money you can allocate to certain things. And so, yeah, you could be like, I'm going to walk away. You may say, I'm going to give it 6 months. You may say, I'll give it a year.
Yeah.
You may say, I want to have a conversation with the person or the persons who employed me and say, hey, this doesn't really match up to what I thought I was going to be
Yeah.
doing. And how can we make this right?
Is
And
there
comp,
good,
that's,
good,
mhm.
good.
Comp isn't always money, by the way. Like comp could be you want a flexible work schedule. Maybe on every summer Fridays you want off. Maybe you want to work virtually or remotely twice a week. Maybe you want tuition reimbursement so you can seek some additional professional development opportunities. So comp also can be much more expansive than just dollars and cents.
Yeah, what do you think about that with regards to, I know during COVID, so many more people went to freelancing and working for themselves and, starting their little, boutiques. I shouldn't say little, but their boutiques and their niche businesses. And so is there a difference in how you negotiate when you're talking to an employer? Like, I work for you, I'm a W-2 versus I'm a 1099?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think there's only a difference if you value what you do differently. And so what I'll say to that is I remember when I first started with my law firm, right? So when I left working for someone else and I started working for myself. And I remember thinking, okay, are there some aspects of my work that I'll do at a lower rate? For example, if I were providing pro bono help or providing help, I'll say this differently, providing assistance to a nonprofit
Yeah,
as opposed
yeah,
to a for-profit organization. Should I bill for the lawyers who are working for me, bill a lower rate because it's a nonprofit versus a for-profit? Well, at the beginning, yeah, that made sense to me. But then as I started looking at the hours and what we were doing, it's the same amount of work, right? It's the same amount of your time, your resources. And so I think one way to look at it is what makes the most sense. If I'm going to work for someone else, there's a comfort that comes along with having a system that's already established and you sort of plug into it. And if there's room for you to get more in the process, by all means do it. When you are freelancing, I think sometimes what people encounter is that the market is so vast that someone may be offering the same thing that you're offering at a lower rate, a much lower rate, where you can't compete
yeah,
because you need to eat, right?
yeah, yeah,
And you have to pay bills. And there are a lot of reasons why that could happen. So I tell people that, and I've been through many business programs, right? Amazing organizations, Goldman Sachs, 10,000 Small Businesses, Tory Burch Foundation program as well, in addition to others that focused on helping entrepreneurs learn the ropes and really excel. And so some of the things that I've learned, I apply. Not only do I apply, I help and teach others. And so with that being said, I would say if you're in a freelance business, a lot of folks went to freelancing during COVID, as you mentioned. And when you're offering something where the market is saturated, then you have to figure out what you need, right? So are you able to offer it at a lower rate, or is it better to have 100 gigs at a low
yeah,
rate or 5 gigs, right?
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
5 gigs to get you there, right? What would you do? Well, like,
Yeah.
what would you do? What would you
I'd
prefer?
rather less clients and more money on those clients. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. What I found is so interesting about that is when I started one of my businesses early, I used to just do business for anybody that would allow me to do business with them. And I realized the ones who paid me the least amount of money were the hardest to please. And the ones who paid me more, like, as long as I delivered, I never hear from them. So
And when it happens,
good.
And when it happens like that, I think you have to like assess, right? Like, because you must have had some awareness to recognize that, right? At some point, like, hey, was that worth all the heartache and stress? Right? Was it? Maybe not.
Absolutely. And so I'm interested in your take on this. I mean, I sit on a couple boards and we're going through a big contract negotiation with one of I won't mention specifics, but one of the boards I'm working on, and we are going through a contract negotiation with an executive. And it reminds me of a situation where he wants something or she wants something. And
Mhm.
because they were an internal candidate, they may not get what they could get somewhere else. And so what I learned
Mm.
is, even in my own experience, I used to do radio way long time ago, 100 years ago. And I realized I would never be seen, because I came up as an intern, I would never be seen as at the same level as somebody who came in from a different station, a different market, a different et cetera, because I came up internally. So sometimes you have to
Mhm.
leave and go somewhere else to be seen and recognized and appropriately paid, because they saw, that's little Will, or that's little Molly. So you have to leave sometimes in order to get the reward for your efforts and experience and et cetera. Can you speak to that?
I'm so happy you said that because some people, exactly what you said, they grew up in the organization and they are loyal. Well, I mean, we have all been there. We're like, oh, I used to go back to the same place to work every summer when I was in college because I loved working there and they looked out for me and I would keep going back. And so when you feel that familiarity, sometimes it is hard to negotiate with leverage. It could also be the opposite, right? You know a lot about the company, you have institutional knowledge,
Mm.
right? And so there are things that you bring to the table that someone coming from the outside won't be able to do. So to me, that's just an additional opportunity, right? Additional leverage that you can utilize to your advantage in the negotiation. And I say that because something that I like to talk about in my book is reframing how you see disadvantages as advantages so that you can expand your toolkit. But for people who were in the company and it's best to sort of go somewhere else to start fresh, I think that goes both ways, meaning the company sees you as little Will, little Damali, and that, they want someone from the outside. And sometimes the unknown might be more appealing. And I've seen exactly that on boards where you have like an interim person and that person only has that position for a year because they don't want people to think that they aren't going to get great candidates from the
Yeah, yeah,
outside
yeah.
because that person has an advantage because they're there. On the same hand, or at the same time, you may also be like, you know what? Everyone knows me. They're never going to see me as this fully developed
That's right.
professional because I started when I was a summer associate. And so I want to start fresh and new. And you also may be more emboldened to ask for what you need, right? Because it's not the person who you used to have lunch with,
Yeah, yeah.
or have those water cooler chats with. So I don't think there's like a fast rule on it. It really depends. And I think whatever's going to give you the most confidence to ask for what you need and perhaps what you want is what you should do.
How do I know that a role I'm going for, lasting on compensation, at least for now? How do I know that a role I'm up for, they're open to negotiate? If they list the job is, $60,000 a year, 100,000, how do I know and confidently approach them with like, hey, is there an opportunity to have a conversation about this? But it was listed at that number.
I would ask the question. That's the only way you could know, right? And so sometimes it says 60K, but maybe there's some wiggle room. Sometimes the compensation package is not just that salary, right?
Hmm.
So sometimes there may be more. And so what I've found is that it depends. The question is the timing of when the ask occurs, right? Because I think most people, one, if it says 60K, they may or may not apply for the job if they know they need 80K, right? So if you're looking at a job opening and you know to cover your expenses, you need 80K, that's already going to weed out some people. But there may be some people who are like, this is like a great opportunity. I really
Yeah.
want it. Maybe it's an organization you want to get your foot in the door, right? And so, let's see, let's go in there and see if there are any synergies. Let me go through the interview process. And so the question is, at what point during the interview process do you ask about whether there's any flexibility in the compensation? I've seen some people have success asking at the beginning, before they get too far in the process, because if they know they need 80K and it's a hard 60K, is really not the best use of
Yeah.
anyone's time to go through the whole process, meet with 8 people, and then you get to the end when they're ready to sign the deal, and you're like,
Yeah.
see, I need 20K more. So some people do it at the beginning. I have actually seen some very successful negotiations, because as you can probably imagine, people call me all the time at different stages in their negotiations. And I've seen some very successful ones where, and I think this is a really great way to have leverage. If you go through the process and there's a range, and this usually happens when there's a range. So, if they say words like starting at 60K as opposed to 60K, or 60K through to 80K, then to me, that's how you know that there's wiggle room. But if you want to check, if you want to confirm, and you want to ask during the interview process, I would wait to see if it's the right fit for both you and for both and the others, for the organization. I would talk to not your boss or future boss, but whoever's in HR, right? Because that gives you some buffer, right? That person can be the intermediary and can ask the questions and find out internally without perhaps, rubbing the person you're going to be reporting to the wrong way. So I would utilize that intermediary, and I would ask that person, is there tell me about the range, or can we talk about the range, or can we be, how creative can the compensation package be? I like that question, Will, because they might be willing to do things that you wouldn't even have considered, because there's some precedent internally within the organization. And how would you have known that? So they may say, we have a bonus structure that I haven't mentioned, we don't always talk about unless someone asks the question. They may say, we also have some stock options or something similar to deferred comp packages. They may have some restrictive stock units, right, that require you to be employed for a certain period of time. So maybe you say, okay, I'll sign on for 3 years, and I won't leave for 3 years, because you know that for over that 3-year period, your RSUs will vest. So there are a lot of different ways to be strategic about comp, and to ask, and to think about who you're asking and when you're asking, whether there's flexibility in the amount that they're offering at the start.
Yeah, what I hear you saying, which I think is really good, is you've got to be clear on what is the value to you, what is the worth to you of this role, because the employer is clear on what it's worth to them, but if you're walking in, you're not sure what it's worth to you to do this. And I think about this from this perspective of, I hear so many people who are public figures and they won't get on a stage unless they're making X. And while I understand that, because a lot of people will take advantage of you and use you to sell tickets and they won't pay you anything, sometimes there's just a stage you need to be on that isn't paying, but it puts you in a position to be in front of people that you may need to be in front of. So you have to just not see it, to your point, as dollars, but then what other benefits are there? And you got to measure those as well.
I'm happy you said that too, because what I'm hearing too is opportunity cost. Right?
Yeah, there you go.
And some things aren't just dollars and cents. I teach at a law school, and I talk to my law students a lot. And as you're getting ready to go out into the world as a young lawyer, there are a lot of things you have to think about, especially if you think about like a general contract, right? People ask me this all the time. Well, can you do this under the contract? And I'll look at the terms of the contract with the strict interpretation and say yes. But then the next question that should follow is, should you do that?
Yeah, that's right. That's
like, should you do it? Like, yeah, you may be allowed to legally do it, right? Well, you can, but should you? And I think the same thing applies to the situation where, and it happens a lot, where people all want a piece of you, and there's only so much time. And sometimes a good way to evaluate what you should be doing with that time comes down to math, right? Yeah. And economics. But I do think that sometimes there is a stage you should be on, and sometimes you don't know how that's going to lead to the next opportunity. And so sometimes you just have to sort of follow where the path will lead you.
Yeah.
But everyone doesn't always have the benefit of being able to do that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the conversation of your legal background and your students, because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. And she's a female black attorney, and she went to Howard to do her
Hey,
law studies, and we had this really interesting conversation. I actually mentioned this on another previous episode, where she was taught that when you grow up, you watch Law and Order, and you watch these attorneys on TV. They're banging the desk in the courtroom, and they're white guys or they're white ladies, and they're doing all this loud stuff, and being really aggressive in the courtroom. And she said her professor said, "You can't do that though, because you will be seen differently than that white guy or that white lady or that less melanated person. But you, as a black woman, you go in that courtroom and you start slamming your fist on the desk, they're gonna see you a whole different way." And so the reason I position this question this way is are there differences in how we need to negotiate versus what our counterparts can get away with?
I love this question. Perception is really huge. And where everyone has control over what they say, how they say it. We can be very thoughtful about it. And on the other side of communication, it's how the person is hearing it and receiving it
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
perceiving it, right? And that's going to be based on experience, exposure, education, bias, implicit
Yeah.
bias.
Yeah.
It could be a whole series of things. And so when we're talking about this example of attorneys, like I can't speak for every field,
Yeah.
but the last time I checked the ABA stats, I think only like it's a very small percentage of lawyers were for Black, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's say 2% or 5%, and maybe
Mm.
2% were women or something to that effect. It was a very small amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so if you think about that, that means that the dominant uh, perception of what a lawyer looks like, sounds like, acts like, talks like in general is still that of a white male,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and so then if you have to think about that being the culture around the law, then how do you be your authentic self in this area where authenticity has been defined and popularized on TV
Yeah. Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
certain way,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so I like the question a lot because perception is, I mean, it's amazing to me. You can say something the same way as someone else, but if you look like me,
Yeah. Yeah.
someone can say, "Well, you seem angry and defensive," and then you're just like, "Well, I wasn't angry or defensive, but now I am." Like, wait, now I am
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you just said like two words that you probably shouldn't have said to me,
Yeah.
only because I was frustrated and annoyed, which is within the whole
Yeah.
realm of human emotion based on this situation. So I think what's interesting about that, I saw a movie recently that had Jamie Foxx in it, and he was a lawyer based on a real case. And he was like a lawyer from the South, and he was working on this big case. And you know which movie we're talking about? It
I
was
know.
so
Yeah.
good. I'm trying to
Yeah.
think of the
I
name
don't
of
know the
it.
name of. I can find it real quick. Yeah.
Yes. And it was so good. And he didn't change his, he was still sort of like this amazing person. But then and he was the same way. And then there was a Black woman lawyer on the other side. And, she went to Howard, which I was like, yes.
Yeah.
And, they still had a lot of respect for each other, even though they were across from each other. Because
Yeah.
again, and they hired her, by the way, because they were like, oh, the other side has like a prominent Black attorney.
Yeah.
So they knew they need to
Yeah.
get another prominent Black attorney on the other side.
Yeah.
So I say
It's the
all this
burial.
to say,
It's the burial.
yes, the burial.
Yeah.
It was so good.
Yeah.
It was so good. And so I say all this to say that I do think that, and let me preface this by saying, I went to Spelman for undergrad. I went to Middlebury, which at that time was still called Monterey Institute of National Studies, which was, I would say, half international, half American. It's in California. I went to Howard Law. I've also been to over 50 countries and 6 continents. So I want to be clear that when I'm making these statements, it's not like for me speaking in a vacuum. It's for me studying abroad in four countries. It's for me traveling extensively. It's for me like being in different rooms where I was the youngest, the only woman of color, the only Black woman, and also seeing other people in these spaces and places and having had extensive conversations and having conducted a lot of research.
Yeah.
So research is key because it's not just about like my perception, but what are the studies also showing? So do I think that in many spaces there's still a perception of what is acceptable from some people and unacceptable from others? 100%. 100%.
Yeah.
And that's not just limited to my field of the law.
And so I'm interested in your perspective on this thing. So historically, at least as a non-lawyer, at least my view of the law is like, if we disagreed on something 30, 40, 50 years ago, you're in court. Like you sue me, I sue you, we're in court. Today, you have all these alternative dispute resolution avenues you can take, mediation, all these things. I'll let you talk about the various types. Can you talk about how those types of things are evolving and in what circumstances you would go down each particular route?
This is such a great question. I know you hear me saying that a lot, but sometimes, people don't ask great questions and you're just like, you're trying to figure out how to answer. But you asked, and I knew you would because I listened to your podcast and I love it.
Thank
and
you.
You're a wonderful, wonderful host.
Thank you
and I'm a big fan. So stop my fangirling for a moment to answer your question.
I appreciate it.
But it's I'm telling you the truth. Like you said, many years ago, the only way people knew how to seek justice for any type of claim they had was to go to court. You still see it on TV. I'm going to sue you. Right? You see it all the time. Nobody's like, I'm going to take you to mediation. Like nobody says
that's not as aggressive.
Right. It doesn't have the same like sting to it. Right. Like, I'm going to get an arbitrator. What? Like nobody ever says that. Right. And so it became something that people knew. Just like if something's wrong, I'm going to call police, right? Like that was the only area that people knew to call if something happened. I know a bear was in their trash and they called the police. I was like, on the bear? Well, what are the police going to do? I mean, I was just like, but that's what came to their mind. There's a bear going through our trash. Call 911, right? Like I'm not faulting them, but I'm just like on the bear.
All right.
So for people who have an issue, for many years it was just the standard. You do something wrong to me, I'm going to sue you. If I fall in your store, I'm going to sue you. If I need a business divorce, right, I'm going to sue you. That was just how it worked. And most contracts reflected that, right? So contracts, if there was any claim that needed to be brought, it would talk about what would happen and what jurisdiction would you go to court, what would be the choice of law or the governing law for the situation, and that's how it was. Many years ago, you started to see more industries adopt alternative dispute resolution processes in their contracts. So, for example, most people have a cell phone. Right. Yeah. If you ever have some free time and you want to read the terms of use, which people just say yes to all the time, not this nerd. I'm like, oh, what does it say? What am I agreeing to use this phone? Right. Do I need to get a pager? But the point is, if you ever look at it, what you'll see is that if you have any claim that you want to bring, you have relinquished your right to go to jury trial, and you've accepted arbitration as the forum for your complaint. And what's interesting about that is not just for your phone. If you're on a computer, I'm assuming, or you have a video camera, all these different all this different technology, often in schools, if your kid is in a private school and there's a contract, all these different things are now usually, instead of going to litigation, are preferring first, usually negotiation, right? In the continuum of dispute resolution processes, there's negotiation first, where there's no third party. Then there's mediation. Well, there's sort of shuttle diplomacy. So what you see happening when a president goes from country to country to try to get, sides to agree. You have that shuttle diplomacy or conciliation. And then you have mediation, where you have a third person who's involved. And with like negotiation or conciliation or mediation, that third person in the middle isn't making a decision. So contracts will say, try to negotiate first. And if that doesn't work, go to mediation. I'm also a mediator. And so you can find someone who can literally get in the middle and help you try to reach a resolution. And then you have arbitration. Now you have a person who is a decision maker, right? The thing about arbitration is that it's not that different from litigation where you have a judge or a jury of your peers deciding the fate of the situation. But with mediation and arbitration, these processes are being put into contracts because it's a better business move.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, it's usually faster, it's usually less expensive. To go to court in many jurisdictions in many states, sometimes you can file a claim and you may not see a judge for several years, several years. You may not even have your first hearing for 18 months, right? So just imagine if you were in a situation that was time sensitive. What if your neighbor is encroaching on your land?
Yeah.
What if something is happening in your job and you're like, what am I supposed to do in the meantime? What you want to separate, but you don't know what to do. Some of these processes are faster and you can control the cost. Litigation is very expensive. So you can control the cost, it's more efficient. And then with mediation especially, you can have your day in court. And what I mean by that is you can speak, you can come and say how you feel. You can say how it's made you feel. It's less formal of a process than arbitration and then litigation, which is at the end of the continuum of dispute resolution. And so when you're talking about how things have changed, I've seen companies recognize that having a dispute resolution process embedded into a contract, or if you look at your employment agreement in general, or if you look at your phone terms of use or computer, or almost everything now, they're incorporating, they're thinking about how to not just speed up the process if there's an issue, but how to keep the costs down. A lot of money is spent fighting claims, and all industries. Tech is not, on the outside of this, and all industries. So it's just a smart business move.
And so finally, I'm going to give you this. So I'm interested in your best toolkit for getting into a negotiation. When you know you're about to walk into one, what do you say I should be equipped with? And I'm gonna give you what I think, and then I'll let you tell me if it's a good strategy or not. And so,
okay.
So my strategy is to think. I want to do my best to understand what that person wants, and if I can understand what they want, I can position myself to either say, you know what they want, what I'm willing to give them to help them get what they want. That helps me determine if it's even a fit for me. But if I know what they want, I understand how to approach them with my alternative take or my, ability to assist them in getting what they want. And then so all the other things waterfall from there. If I understand what you're trying to get out of this, then I'm better equipped to make sure that we find a ground that we both can live with. What do you think?
One, I'm going to say I like that a lot. And I can tell that that's been very useful in your life,
Yes.
like figuring out what the other side wants, and then figuring out, okay, now that I know what they want, then I can try to meet with their wants and then also get what I want to, right? And I like how you said it's like a waterfall down from there. I think that's a really smart strategy, Will. And if it works for you, you should keep on doing it, right?
Okay.
You keep doing it. What I'm going to say is that I think that going into every negotiation, there are 5 foundational elements, and I call them the foundational 5 in my book, that every negotiation has. And the first one is knowing what you want, right? Yeah. And your take on it too is, what does the other side want? And I'll get to that in a moment. But for the foundational 5, know what you want. And by the way, it's things that you have to know. So you have to know what you want, know what you need, know how to actively listen, know how to communicate, and know when to close. Because how many times have you gotten like 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you didn't know when to stop. You didn't know when to walk away. And you're just like, now is a good time? Like, what should I do? And so when I hear you talking about knowing what the other person wants, I love that. And I'm going to push you. I'm going to push you, Will, to say, go past the want because the want is what they're articulating that they want, and get to the why do they want it. That's the need. Because people will tell you what they want all the time. You know, I want a raise, I want a new car, I want to get married before I'm 30, you know, what they want. But when you start to unpack that, understand why they want it, because you may not be able to get them, you know, meet them where they are. What if you know what I want, right? What if I tell you I want X and you know that, but you don't know why I want it? So think about, like, if you knew why I wanted it, then maybe you can help me meet that need a different way, maybe even in a way that I didn't think about it, right? And I know you can do this because we were chatting and I was asking some questions about podcasting. You heard what I needed. So it might just be a little bit of semantics with want and need, right? I do think that they're different. I do think that what people say that they want is usually more fixed. And if you can figure out the need, and to your point, like where there's some shared common goals and common ground, then everything does waterfall from there. And part of that, what I'm hearing you say, and I know that you do because you're very successful, is you have to be listening to them. People don't always listen when someone else is talking. Well, I mean, you've made a career of listening to people. I mean, so you get it, but people don't always listen. They don't listen because they're thinking about what they're going to say next. They're not listening because they don't like what they're hearing, right? So they stop listening. And if we're being honest, sometimes people don't listen because they don't like the other person who's talking, right? They have no regard for that person and they don't want to hear what they're saying. But the way that you learn what someone wants and what they need is to actively listen to what they're saying and perhaps hearing what they aren't saying.
That's right.
And seeing the nonverbal cues and then communicating in a way that's thoughtful, right? That communication to me, and I think that's why I put listening first and then communicating, like in order to kind of get somewhere in a negotiation. Don't get me wrong, I can talk, but I like to listen and kind of take it all in and then know when to walk away. Did you concede too much? Did you give them everything they wanted and you only got one or two things that you wanted, but are they weighed the same, right? Maybe what you wanted was really what you needed, right? And so it's okay to close and to wrap it up. And so I think that if there was one takeaway in terms of like getting what you need in a negotiation, and I always say, like, you know, I don't know, Will, like there's this song back in the day that was like, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you'll get what you need.
That's right.
And I've said that to like groups of people who I'll say are a lot younger than me, and they're just like, I've never heard that song before. So I'll be like, oh, you know, this song, I want it. I got it. I want it. You know, that song, like, that's a more contemporary song. I have to like change my analogy. So, but it's like that. Like, I feel like the reason that I think people are successful in negotiations oftentimes goes deeper than helping people get what they want. It's like getting what they need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. Negotiating While Black, where can we get it? Tell us about it. Make your pitch. All the things.
I appreciate that. You know, my book is available anywhere you buy books. It's everywhere. Right now, the editors at Amazon picked it as a top pick for the month of June. They picked it as best in nonfiction. Ebony said you have to read it. Thank you so much. Essen said it's one of the top 15 books to dive into this summer. Ebony said one of Black authors to read this summer, along with like Questlove and Taraji P. Henson. I love being in their company. Taraji's from DC like me. I play the drums like Questlove.
Hey, I'm a drummer too, so yeah, I dig it.
You know what? We have to have a jam session, Will. Why are we wasting time talking? We could have been jamming. I want to do over a jam session. I want to do over. I've heard a lot of episodes, and I didn't know you were a drummer. I didn't hear you say this in any episode.
I haven't talked about it much, but I've been playing drums since I was 10.
What? I even heard, was it Aaron Samuels say that he was traveling doing spoken word? I was so impressed. And all this time you were a drummer, and I didn't even know.
Since I was 10 years old,
Me too.
Yeah.
Me
Wow.
too.
Yeah. That's
Okay,
fantastic.
we have to have a jam session.
Let's do
You
it.
know, we have to have a jam session.
Let's do it.
The book is everywhere. I mean, I think what's as important as knowing that it's everywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart, everywhere, is when you read it, review it. I think that
Yeah.
that's
There you
something
go.
that people are buying it. That's great, and then review it. You know, tell people what you think of the book. I spent a lot of time writing and researching. The stories are good stories, but
Yeah.
it's not just story based. We come from a people who are storytellers. We're griots, right? So the stories are still good stories, and there's no legalese. Will, it's not boring. It's like you and I talking right now.
Yeah.
It's also on Audible. I narrated myself. They
Oh
had
yeah.
me in the studio. Well, I wish I was playing the drums, but they had me talking in the studio.
Damali Peterman, so good to have you. Thank you for joining me.